Hi, welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Bernard Cornwell has long been a national literary treasure on both sides of the Atlantic. Whether for his legendary Sharp series, the Saxton Story series, the Starbuck Chronicles, or the Wardler Chronicles, among many other bestsellers in his catalog, he takes out time today to join us for a rare interview, and we're so excited to have him on the show. Mr. Cornwell, thank you so much again for joining us. The great C.S. Forester was a novelist I understand got you excited early on about reading. Who were some others that you couldn't put down once you started?
Well, Forrester was one. I think he probably happened after I was 10. Um, I actually don't really remember because I was brought up in a very strange family that belonged to a sect called the Peculiar People. And the last time I counted, there were 76 Bibles in the house. So I suspect that much of the reading was provided by them. And it's amazing that I went on reading at all, to be honest. I think probably when I was between 12 and 14, that sort of age. And it was then that I discovered Hornblower and historical novels. And at that point, it took off.
As a child, when do you first remember discovering your native love of history? It stayed with you throughout your storied literary career.
Well, I have to think it was Forrester's skill. I mean, his skill with characters and a storyteller. And I became hooked on stories. And I think I always did have an interest in history. I grew up in an area where there were things ranging from Neolithic remains to medieval remains. And I've never really thought too much about it. I mean, I've always loved history. And then, as I say, along came Forrester.
By the time you arrived at University College London, who were a few of the new gateway minds that really broadened your evolution as a writer?
I had a wonderful man called Thomas Blackburn, who was a great poet. And he was an extraordinary man and wonderful company. I'm not sure that he was a good influence, but he was an influence. And through him, I met a lot of other writers. But although I did, I think right from a very early age, thought that writing was easier than working, which is not true, by the way. I did want to become a writer, although that didn't happen for many, many years after that.
You began your career with words, working with some very distinguished media companies like BBC, BBC Northern Ireland, BBC Nationwide, Thames Television, all before becoming a novelist. How helpful was that to your evolution toward that eventual profession?
Well, I think the main thing is that I was working on a daily television program and we had to fill a lot of space, a lot of airspace. So it took away the fear of the empty page. I mean, when somebody said we need an intro to this, you just sat down and wrote it. You didn't worry too much about it. And I think that was probably the main lesson, which was just not to be frightened of empty paper.
Out of curiosity, how long was Richard Sharp knocking on the door before you first answered?
Oh, well, I think he was there for a long time before I wrote him. I mean, there was this ambition to write, and you write, well, you should write what you want to read. I mean, your first reader is yourself. And there I was, totally under the spell of Hornblower. And it occurred to me sometime in my 20s that it was very odd that there were several guys writing novels about the Royal Navy in the Napoleonic Wars, and nobody had done the same for the army. And yet there were extraordinary stories to be told there. And so I thought, well, that's a gap on the bookshelf. And I kept looking for those books. I kept haunting bookshops, waiting for someone to come along with the stories of Hornblower on land. And they didn't. And then one day a dim light bulb went off in my head and I thought, well, why don't you do it? So he was there for a long, long time. And then finally I decided to try. Sean Bean's voice. I hear that Yorkshire accent. And I see him quite distinctly. And I see him as I've always seen him right from the start. But I do hear Sean Bean's voice. No, I think I see him as an extraordinarily formidable character. And I'm not sure he'd like me very much, but I like him a lot.
That's such a lucky foot in the door for any author when they can find a space on the shelf that needs to be filled that hasn't yet. With Sharp's Tiger, you really started that journey with the series. Tell us about the creation of that first book.
Well, I knew a lot about it. I mean, when I was young and I read Hornblower, when the Hornblower book stopped, I think he only wrote 11, I ran off the end of it and found books about the Napoleonic Wars, non-fiction, and got fascinated by Wellington and his campaigns, especially in Spain and Portugal. So that became the thing to write about. So the research, well, I mean, I'd read everything there was to read, I think. I think that's true. And then I went and toured Spain and Portugal to see the places, which was extraordinary. It was wonderful. was a wonderful sort of 2 months wandering around Spain and Portugal. And I read memoirs and I read letters and diaries. So I was steeped in it, absolutely steeped in it. But I mean, you talk about some guys planning it all out beforehand. I mean, I wish I could do it. I just wish, but I never could. Originally, I wanted to start with the Siege of Badajoz because that is such an extraordinary story. But I thought that's probably a bit ambitious for the first book. So I'll take him back 2 or 3 years and find out how to do this before I actually tackle that book. Although it remains one of my favorite books, Sharp's Company, about Badajoz. But it was really, none of it was planned. I mean, I think obviously I knew in Eagle that it was going to end at Talavera. The easy thing about a Sharp book is you usually know where it's going to end. It's either Talavera or Salamanca or Vitoria or whatever it is. So you have to build towards it. But I've never been able to plan a book. And the way I write a book is to find out what happens as I write it. And it can be very frustrating. He makes wrong decisions and you suddenly find the story's, he's going to be dead in another 3 paragraphs unless you go back 4 chapters and change a decision you made there. So you're forever going back and changing things and going forward again.
So it sounds like you find if you map too much out, it gets in the way of the creativity.
I just can't plan a book. Never have been able to, never will. I mean, when I start a new book, it's that blank page and you start him off, do something with him or her and see what happens. And actually, I like that way. Although I do think it's inefficient, but I do quite like it. Because the joy of reading is to find out what happens. The joy for me of writing a book is to find out what happens. 2/3 of the way through one now, and I really don't know what's going to happen in the next chapter. No, not a clue. But I mean, I'll start it off later today and find out that he's doing something.
We've had all kinds of really great stories from legendary authors like yourself of long-running series regulars talking about the creation of their names, how they first came to them. Where did Richard Sharp first arrive to you as the right name for this lead character?
He was a rugby player, a great, great rugby player. He didn't have an E on his name. It was Richard Sharp without the E. And he played from Cornwell and for England. And I tried, I can remember when I wrote the first Sharp book, and I wanted a name something like Hornblower. And I kept trying out names, Trumpet Whistler, God knows what else. I don't remember. And I just couldn't come up with a name. And I thought, okay, I'll name him after my hero, Richard Sharp. And then when I find the real name, I'll go through, cross out Richard and Sharp and put in whatever it is. Well, of course, it's stuck like a hook in a gill. And he's been Richard Sharp ever since.
We hear about a common theme early in an author's career where they have to be really persistent to land a literary agent. You have a pretty entertaining story about how you did just that. Would you share it with us?
When I wrote Sharp's Eagle, I sent it off to a publisher in England. I was living in the States then. And they wrote back and made me an offer. And I knew it was not the offer I needed because I needed enough money to write the second book. And then by pure chance, I went to a Thanksgiving Day party in New York and at a friend's house or apartment. And we were overlooking Central Park East, and the Thanksgiving Day parade goes down that avenue. And I was standing on the balcony with the biggest Bloody Mary I've ever seen in my life. And the McDonald's All-America High School Band was high-stepping down beneath us. And a voice said in my ear, "They do this sort of thing frightfully well, don't they?" And I, being a brilliant conversationalist, said, "Oh, you're English?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a literary agent." I said, "Oh, I've just written a book." And he said to that, "Fuck," turned around and walked away. So I followed him into the room and I said, "I've had an offer on my book." And his eyes lit up. And he said, "How much?" And I said, £3,000 world rights. Then he said, "It must be a fucking awful book." And he turned and walked away again. And I got him a third time. And I begged him, almost on my knees, saying, "Please read my book." He said, "Oh, dear boy, if you must," he said, "meet me at Grand Central Station, Oyster Bar, tomorrow at midday." So I did and gave him the book and had a rather awkward lunch with this man I didn't know. Went home, and that evening he called me and said, "How much money do you want?" And within 2 weeks, I had a 7-book contract. And he stayed my agent till the bitter end.
In early books in the series like Sharp's Regiment and Sharp's Siege, readers are really led firsthand through these battles with Richard Sharp right in the middle of them. It must have been quite cinematic as you were creating all that on the page.
I think it is. It's very visual. And I touch type 2, which means there's a lot of correcting going on later. Yeah, it's very, very visual. And I was very, very much influenced by the great Sir John Keegan in his book, The Face of Battle, um, where he writes not just about the shape of a battle and what happened, what was it actually like to be there? What was it like to be at Agincourt on the Somme? Um, and you have to focus and go all the way down to one person's point of view, but at the same time keep a bird's eye view of what's going on around him, which is he wouldn't have known. I mean, Sharp in most of these battles wouldn't have had a clue what was going on outside of 30 or 40 paces, and most of that was obscured by musket smoke. But my job is to give him a rather godlike power of understanding things that are happening beyond that very small area. But yeah, it's very visual.
Along the same lines, you're one of the great masters of bringing battle scenes to life realistically in books. For aspiring authors watching that might be trying to do the same and having trouble, any advice?
The first trick of writing a battle is to make sure that the reader understands the geography. I mean, when I wrote a non-fiction book on Waterloo, and the very first chapter is about the battlefield. Nothing else, just the battlefield. So that when you get to the story itself, you're not forever having to leaf through the book to find a map or going to the index to find out what something is. So you start with the battlefield. And once that you think the battlefield is clearly described, then you start populating it, and then you take it all the way down to Sharp's or Outre's point of view, which is really where the excitement is, of course. And you could give them a little bit more understanding than perhaps most soldiers had of the thing, because they're going to have to do something heroic, otherwise there's no point in being in a book.
You surround Sharp with so many memorable supporting cast characters that he fights alongside during his extensive military career. Any favorites you most enjoyed writing personally?
Again, it's all part of this process of writing to find out what happens. I mean, I can remember there was one book, I have no idea which book it is, where I needed a convenient general to give Sharp an order. So I made up Major General Nairn, and he was only supposed to be in the book for about 3 pages. He basically took the book over. He was so memorable a character. And that's wonderful when that happens. But, I don't know. I've never thought about how do you create a character. I mean, I just hope that I see them in my head, I let them speak, and with any luck, they catch fire.
Sharp's battles and travel stay just as exciting in later volumes like Sharp's Escape and Sharp's Fury, but he ages with each book. How did you keep that realistic as you were writing it?
And yeah, they do get older. Sharp never gets that old. I mean, Uhtred, my character in the Saxon books, is much too ancient when he fights his last battle. But luckily, Beowulf was about the same age when he fought his last battle, so I've got some supporting evidence. They have more experience. They react differently. He's no slower. He's still just as angry. I'm talking Sharp now, as he ever was, and capable of anger. I don't know. I mean, I grow older. I'm much too old now. I'm ancient, and maybe that's just a reflection of that.
For fans of the series, why was Richard Sharp's anger so important to his continual drive to fight throughout the series?
I have no idea. He just was. I mean, right from the beginning, he was angry. The only thing I'd planned for Sharp before I began writing him was that he was up from the ranks, that he'd been promoted from a private up to being an officer. And that wasn't as unusual as people think. And the other thing I'd worked out is that his enemies couldn't just be the French, because they were always somewhere else. The enemies have to be on your own side. And to Sharp, most officers are enemies, even though he's an officer himself. And yeah, he is angry. He's got a huge chip on his shoulder. It's Tom Brady resenting the fact that he was the 196th choice in the draft. I don't know if it's true. People say that's driven him through his career. Well, if it has, it was a jolly good thing he was 196th in the draft. And Sharp has a certain resentment against officers who he doesn't like. And I guess that gives him his anger.
It would drive me insane trying to keep all the wars straight that Sharp's fought in throughout his extensive career and catalog. Do you have any kind of an internal organizing system to keep it all straight?
I can't remember what's in the books. I've written too many. And I have wonderful readers who write and ask me questions. And they say, why did you kill off so-and-so? And I can't even remember who so-and-so was, let alone why I killed him.
After decades writing him, you took an extended vacation over the past 15 years from Sharp. Can fans of the series expect to see him again in the near future?
I like Sharp. I like his company. I'm writing him at the moment. It'll be the 22nd Sharp book. And I haven't written a Sharp for, I don't know, must be at least 10 years. And yet he sort of came back into my head, just there he was, just as grumpy as ever. And I think it's partly that, just I enjoy his company, I like him, I like writing him.
In that case, was it an easy reunion, picking back up with them on the page after so many years off?
I dislike reading my books, but I did read a couple of them. And of course, I wrote Waterloo not that long ago, so all that research is still in my head. But I mean, the truth is, the moment I wrote the first line, I could see him, smell him, hear him. And he'd never really gone away. I'm sure, you know, if I waited another 10 years, if I should live that long, I could go back to Uhtred and he would just immediately come back. But no, that was a great pleasure writing Sharp again. I mean, and although I'm only 2/3 of the way through, I'm enjoying it. I have no idea where he's going, by the way, but we'll get there.
With Nathaniel Starbuck and the Starbuck Chronicles, you really vividly captured this very bloody but seminally important period in our history with 1860s and the Civil War. Please tell us what first intrigued you about that period in history to make you want to dive so deep into it.
Well, again, it's always the story. I mean, I will confess that Starbuck in many ways was sort of an offspring of Sharp. He's just in a different army in a different continent. And it got so bad that there were times when I would finish a Starbuck book and then I would put the whole novel together on the computer and tell the find and replace to find Sharp and replace him with Starbuck. And it would come up and say 71 mentions of Sharp have been renamed. You know, get it right next time. And writing Starbuck was very much like writing Sharp. But in the end, I think I always knew that Starbuck was fighting for the wrong side. People still ask me to please write more Starbuck stories, but I'm not sure that I ever will. I liked him and I enjoyed his company.
Turning to the wildly popular The Saxton Story series, which is largely the reason for the absence of the Sharp books over the last 15 years, what have you most enjoyed about writing the 13 books that have so far carried this series to such success?
The Saxton stories. Well, they have an interesting genesis. I met my real father very late in life. I was in my 50s. And he showed me the family tree. And it said we were descended from some man called Uhtred, who had owned Bebbanburg in the 8th or 9th century. And I'd always been interested in the Saxons, and I'd always wanted to tell the story of how England was created, because nobody knows. The English are entirely ignorant about the genesis of England. I mean, it's not like America, where we're lucky enough to know what happened in 1776. So nobody knows. I mean, England was just this mystery. They say there'll always be an England. They assume there always was. Well, there wasn't. And England had to be fought for, had to be put together. And I wanted to tell that story. And most historical novels have, if you like, a big story and a little story. And the big story is the creation of England. The little story is the adventures of some guy through that period. And I didn't have the guy. And now suddenly, having met my real father, I did. I thought, okay, he's my ancestor. I can write about him. I can say what I like about him. I can be rude about him. I can make things up for him. I can invent everything. So that's where it began. It began with me being not fascinated by my ancestor, because we know almost nothing about him. We're just deciding to make him up.
What have been your favorite moments so far of walking in the shoes of the lead character in this series, Uhtred?
It was Uhtred being rude to the church, which he was very good at. And those were always enjoyable moments. And I think that's probably what I enjoyed most. I mean, I was obviously fascinated by King Alfred, who was a great king. And he's called Alfred the Great, and he deserves it. And I think that our image of Alfred the Great is entirely wrong. If you go to England and you look at the statues of Alfred, you see this man who looks like a linebacker in chain mail with a helmet and carrying a huge sword. Now, he did win his wars, but he was no linebacker. He was a very frail man. He was sick his whole life. He suffered probably, we don't know, but we think from Crohn's disease. He collapsed at his own wedding. And we know that he was sick his whole life. And we also know that his priorities were learning and the church. He's a very pious, very intelligent, very well-educated man. And this doesn't add up to a picture of a great warrior. But he is also extraordinarily intelligent. And the intelligence, if you like, is his weapon. And he uses that intelligence to create a strategy which will defeat the Danes and which will, in the end, unite the kingdoms, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, into one kingdom called England. And that was his dream. He wanted to create that, but he didn't live to see it. It was his son and his daughter and his grandson who made the dream come true. And I liked Alfred, although I'm not sure I would have liked him in real life. I have a distaste for Puritans, and there's no doubt he was a Puritan at heart. So I decided that Uhtred had to be his opposite, and they should be opposites, and they should be in many ways opposed to each other, because that made the whole thing more interesting. So I always enjoyed it. I mean, Uhtred treats Alfred with great respect. He recognizes the man's genius, but he treats the bishops and priests with absolute scorn.
Why did it make sense narratively to write these books from the point of view of an older Uhtred?
He had to be old to remember the whole story, and too old at the end, to be honest, although we go back to Beowulf. So yeah, and I'd never written, until I wrote the books about Arthur. The first one was The Winter King. I'd never written a book in the first person because in some ways it's very confining. And if you're in the first person, you can never change the point of view. You can't see the ambush coming. But I did it with the Arthur books and then actually rather enjoyed it. And now, having gone back to writing Sharp, I've had to go back after many, many years to writing the third person. And there are advantages to both, of course. But as a reader, I'm not sure I really like the change of point of view. I mean, suddenly the new voice is the new focus is somebody else in the book. It can be a bit off-putting. I try and keep it the same one, not always. But if you're writing first person, you have to keep it to the same point of view. And also, in some ways, I think first person is easier to write. You're allowed opinions that you can't put in a third person book so much. You do find yourself writing a lot, as I later learned, which is a device, and it's horrible, but you have to do it.
You really authentically capture the fear these soldiers feel heading into battle. I have to imagine that's a very essential part of it, though.
I hope so. I mean, I'd be terrified. I mean, I write a lot about shield walls, and there's a very ancient poem, Y Gododdin, about a Welsh expedition to attack the Saxons. And at some point, the Welsh poet says, "We were a mead-soaked host," meaning we were drunk. And if you're going into a shield wall against these guys carrying battle axes and swords and spears, I think you'd have to be slightly drunk to do it. I mean, it's utterly terrifying, quite terrifying.
With the Warlord Chronicles, how much fun was it to put your own spin on the whole legend of King Arthur and Excalibur? And he was actually more of a warlord than a king, to be technically accurate, correct?
I'm sure that was the truth. I mean, the very, very earliest tales of Arthur never call him a king. They say he was a dux bellorum, a leader of battle. And my own theory, and it is only a theory because, I mean, talking about King Arthur in front of historians is like talking about healing crystals to the American Medical Association. You're onto a hiding to nothing. I think he was probably the British warlord who led them at the Battle of Mountbatten. But yes, he was a warlord. I mean, all the evidence suggests that. He becomes a king later on, just as he becomes a Christianized figure later on. In the early stuff, I mean, the early saints' lives written in Wales, he's a villain. He's a thief, a would-be rapist, a murderer. And yet suddenly he becomes this sort of very Christian, perfect general, perfect gentle knight, because they couldn't get rid of him. I think the church tried to get rid of him, but people insisted on going on telling stories about him. And so the stories changed and he became better and better. And in some ways more boring than ever.
Well, you certainly changed that in this series. By the way, approaching Merlin, there's a lot of fact versus fiction and whether he was a really clever magician versus legitimate wizard. How important was his role in the grand scheme of things?
When I began writing that, I thought I'll put nothing in the books that wasn't in it before the 12th century, which has left Merlin out. And then, I mean, very quickly in writing the first book, I realized you had to have Merlin. And so I tried to make Merlin's magic believable. I mean, I was delighted to discover that you can make skin glow in the dark with the juice from, I can't remember the name of the shellfish, but once you found that, you know, so I was actually becoming a magician from Merlin. But in the end, the magic rather took over. I mean, Merlin is just too compelling a character. And it got to the point where I simply had to give in to him and let him do it. You know, there were a whole series of Merlin stories that were quite separate to the Arthurian stories, and they got rolled together. I suppose that what Merlin is one, he's obviously very wise, and he's also mischievous. And in some ways, and this sounds rather weird, he's Arthur's touchstone to reality. He's a great character, Merlin. He's a wonderful character. I mean, I enjoyed writing him enormously, and in one sense, he comes in much too late in the first book. But once he's in, you can't get him out.
The Grail Quest took readers back on a trip to another really storied period in our history. What first inspired you to want to set fact from fiction aside in that mythical search for the Holy Grail?
I can't say the Holy Grail comes out of it terribly well, but you know, it's always, what are you going to write next? And I'm facing that problem at the moment. What do I do after this book? And I've got a couple of ideas. I think at some point, I can't remember when, I decided it would be rather good to go back to the 100 Years' War. So up came the Grail Quest. And the Grail just gave it a sort of added interest. I mean, they were besotted by this thing. And I think there's an Italian cathedral that claims to have it, but maybe they do.
Being a child of the 80s myself, Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail was my portal into that whole legend back then.
Absolutely, yes, the holy hand grenade.
With Waterloo, the history of 4 days, 3 armies, and 3 battles, you really gave a masterclass for readers in nonfiction and packing so much into one book. Please tell us about how you pulled that off.
It was fun to write. And the nice thing about that book, of course, is that 95% of writing a novel is discovering the story, at least if you do it my way. I mean, it's a huge amount of the work. Once you've actually got that first draft down and you like the story, then the rest, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's fun, because that's when you put the glossy bits in and the jokes, which are important. With Waterloo, my only non-fiction book, I didn't have to find the story. It was there, presented to you in history, and it's an extraordinary story. I mean, to this day, I still find it exciting when I find a new book on Waterloo and read it. So that was the enjoyment of that book, was just having the story and then populating it with real people and with their memoirs and with their diaries and so on. And also trying to get into their heads a little about what were they thinking at that point of the battle, and what did they know and what did they not know. It must have been an absolutely terrifying day, quite terrifying.
It's easy to tell that books like Wild Track, Sea Lord, and Storm Child were all written by a sailor, yourself, taking years of experience in the water and putting it on the page. Please tell us how much fun you had with that.
Yes, those books were, sort of modern thrillers. And again, it goes right back to almost the beginning of my writing career, when back then, I always wrote 2 books a year. I mean, nowadays I've slowed down to just one and spend the summer sailing. But my then publisher, who was still my publisher, said we can't publish 2 Cornwell books a year. And another publisher said, well, if they won't, we'll publish the second one. So I thought I'd better write something entirely different. So I decided to write these sailing thrillers, which were fun. And I also noticed that when I'm writing the Saxon series, that whenever Uhtred goes to sea, the books perk up. You know, if I ever felt they were getting a bit dull and slow, I'd put him on his boat and he'd be happy again. I just love sailing and spend a lot of the summer in Nantucket Sound and thereabouts. It's a French boat, a Beneteau, Oceanus 32. She's called Seraph. And there was a reason for calling her Seraph, which is I crossed the Atlantic on a friend's boat, and his boat was called Seraphim. And so I named Seraph after Seraphim. It took me a whole year to realize it was an anagram of sharp.
Whether it's Sean Bean bringing the character Sharp to life on the show with the same title on BBC so memorably, or The Last Kingdom on Netflix, or recently BBC America announcing that the Saxon Chronicles was coming to life on the screen, it must be fun watching all these adaptations of these characters you invented.
I met them a few times. Both productions, both the Netflix Last Kingdom and Sharp, were kind enough to say, did I want to be a technical advisor? And I said no. And I don't. I don't want to be involved at all. I mean, they very nicely send me scripts, which they don't know it, but I don't read them. I take the view that any involvement by me is probably going to be an obstacle to their ambition. And they're doing a terrific job, and it's best to let them do it. They know a lot about making television drama. I know nothing about making television drama. I enjoy them, but I don't. It's almost as though they're nothing to do with me. I mean, sometimes when we're watching one, Judy will say, "Why is he doing that?" And I said, "I don't know. I didn't write this. You have to ask them." And people, I mean, I do get readers who say, well, they've changed the books. And I just write back and say, well, you're lucky. You're getting 2 for the price of 1. I think they're wonderful. I mean, obviously I do. I think they're terrific. But I watch them just like every other viewer. I watch them not knowing what's going to happen and not knowing. I mean, I had an email from one of the actors the other day in which she said, my daughter is gorgeous. And I thought, I never gave you a daughter in the book. But fine, you know, they've given her a daughter and she's gorgeous, so we've got something to look forward to. I can remember watching the first Sharps and thinking, I had nothing to do with this, which is not true in the sense that they had taken my stories, but it just seems too extraordinary. And I still feel that with The Last Kingdom. I mean, they're very nice. They asked me if I wanted to be in one, and I said yes. So I got what they call a cameo appearance. And they're incredibly generous. They flew us to Hungary where they were filming, and I think we spent 3 or 4 days there. And they gave me hair extensions down to my waist and then killed me off. And I thought, well, here I am being killed by my own hero. This is a great privilege. But I mean, that was the most I ever got involved, and it was quite wonderful and it was fun. But I really do feel as though I had very little to do with it.
It seems like you've had a lot of fun with standalones like Redcoat, where you tell the Valley Forge story from the point of view of a British soldier, or Gallows Thief or Stonehenge, which is legendary, of course, in Britain lore. Did you actually travel there to do the research for that book?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was the fascination. What is this? And I often think that book is really a failure because I don't think I created a believable theology for these people. A good friend of mine said it takes wing, but it doesn't sustain flight, which is probably true. All those standalones really are books I wanted to write, but didn't really want to write a series about. I think my favorite is Gallows Thief, and I am tempted to go back to him because I rather liked him and tell him another story of his, but I don't know that I will.
With Fools and Mortals, you travel back to the time of Shakespeare, and I've been dying to ask you this for years. There's been so much legend over time about whether Shakespeare was one guy or a troupe of writers. When this research was going on for this book, were you able to definitively uncover that one way or the other?
He is one writer.
And for any naysayers watching out there, what in your research led you to that conclusion?
Well, I guess reading. I mean, not just reading Shakespeare, but reading all the wonderful writers who've written about him. Stephen Greenblatt, James Shapiro, and so on. I mean, and there's plenty of evidence that he was one writer. There's this whole nonsense about somebody else was Shakespeare, and it is nonsense. I mean, it was begun by a poor woman in New England, Delia Bacon, who eventually died in a lunatic asylum believing she was the Holy Ghost. And then her idea was picked up by an Englishman called Looney, and he was. And I don't understand why people don't want Shakespeare to be Shakespeare. But for me, all that began when the point at which I stopped writing 2 books a year, and this goes back about, 15 years, when I fell among actors. And to my surprise, at the ripe old age of 60-something, found myself on stage in a summer stock theatre every summer. And every year we would do at least one Shakespeare play. We did all sorts of things. I actually had a solo in Man of La Mancha, which still gives me nightmares. I can wake at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat. But I played Toby Belch, I played Henry IV, I played Prospero in The Tempest. And the more I worked with this company, the more I became interested in Shakespeare. And it occurred to me that in many ways that what we were doing was very similar to what he had been doing back in the Globe Theatre, or before that in the theatre, as he called it. And that really started there. And the book is in some ways a love letter to the theatre. And very sadly, the theatre was sold 2 years ago, so it's ended. So now I have no acting and no company and no plays, and instead I have to go sailing. It's a hard life.
Shakespeare was quite funny too. By the way, humor has always woven itself so effectively throughout your books. Why has it always been such a key part of your formula, no matter what part of history or battlefield you're writing in and on?
Because they're talking about human beings. And I mean, you know that when there's a group of guys together, a lot of jokes are told, often very bad jokes, but attempts at humor. It's the way men bond. And I'm not very good at writing humor, but I do try to put some humor into every book.
What do you like to tell fans who might also be beginning authors at any age about some of the absolutes that are required to getting started effectively in a writing career? My first is always be writing.
A lot of people ask me, how can they write a book? And you say, well, you write it. You sit down, you start, and you write it. Thing's not going to write itself. You actually have to sit with the damn keyboard and pound it out. I always say, if you want to be a writer, you've got to be a reader. And I say, you write for yourself. You do not write. It's no good. I mean, if somebody brings out a book called 50 Shades of Grey and it's a runaway bestseller, don't sit down and write 50 Shades of Brown, because it's not going to be as good. And it's not your book. It's somebody else's book, and you're just trying to cash in. Write what you want to read. And then you hope that what you like to read, an agent will like, and then a publisher will like, and then readers will like. But I do think you write for yourself. You write to amuse yourself. You write what you want to read. And if you don't, it's not going to work.
What about from the business side of the book trade?
You're dealing with contracts. And contracts brings up the dreadful word lawyer. Now, if you're somebody who absolutely understands every subclause in a contract, and they're pages long, as you know, and it deals with the net percentage for whatever, it goes on and on and on and on. If you understand all that, then great, be your own agent and obviously work for you, Jake. But I don't. And of course, agents also know publishers. They know what publishers are looking for what books. I couldn't have done it without an agent. His name was Toby Eady, and he was a wonderful guy. He was a great fisherman.
After doing this for so many decades, when you sit down each morning to write, what still puts the biggest smile on your face?
Oh, it's the characters. I mean, it's the story and the characters. And you do fall in love with some of your characters, especially the women. And you enjoy the company of others, and you hate others. And, you can actually plot their revenge. You're God for that. There's 6 months. You can create people's lives. But I think it's the characters. And hearing them speak. They often surprise me. They'll say something, and I thought, where did that come from?
Have you ever killed anybody off in one of your books that had a real life muse you were getting vicarious revenge on?
And only I and my wife know who they are, but they're there. That can be fun.
Have you ever beheaded one of them?
I mentioned, of course, that Sharp was named after a rugby player. And there was an infamous occasion when England was playing South Africa, and a South African rugby player hacked his ankle. I won't say it was deliberate because I can't tell, but it certainly looked as if it was not by accident. And by chance, the man had a French name. So I put him in a book, and before Sharp kills him, he breaks his ankle. I mean, there are little things like that which give you pleasure, just to sort of, minor revenges. And I had a very great agent until sadly he died a couple of years ago. But he had an enemy who had been his ex-wife's divorce lawyer. So for Toby, I put in him and gave him a very horrible time.
I'm curious, among that library of bookshelves back there that contains your vast catalog, any favorites that you ever pull down and are really proudest of that you wrote?
I have a favorite. Well, I do, but I hate to admit it. I mean, I'm obviously very fond of Sharp because Sharp basically saw me through the first, 10, 15 years of my writer's life. And he keeps the dog fed, which is very good of him. I'm very fond of Waterloo for nonfiction. I think because it's the only nonfiction book I will ever write. And if you like, I got away with it. I think that's why. And I'm sure I'm fond of Uhtred. I have to be. But I suppose the best answer is it's the next book I write. And the awful thing is I can't remember most of them. I can't remember what's in them. And I mean, you write a book, and for me, like 6 months or so of my life is totally consumed by it. I mean, you take the dog for a walk, you'll hear the characters speak in your head. My wife will say, "What are you thinking about?" And I say, "What do you think?" Because I'm thinking about what will happen next, or what just happened, or what I should change. And then you finish it and you deliver the book, and that's it. Boom, it goes. And it just vanishes.
That was actually the subject of my next question. And for the viewers watching among your fans from around the world, what can they expect next from you? Whether it's Sharp or whether it's any other kind of new project. And what keeps you most excited as you continue creating after so many years doing this?
There are, but I rarely talk about them. I am thinking of going back to medieval times. I think I'll leave it at that.
Is that journey still one of the great loves of writing for you?
Oh, I think the journey is everything. And it's the hardest bit of it. It really is the hardest bit. Just to find out what happens. I mean, I have a huge envy of people like Joanna Rowley, who could plot the whole series out before she even started writing it. I mean, that must be wonderful. But I just can't do it. I can't even plot a chapter ahead. Seriously, I'm on chapter 8 at the moment, and I have no idea how 8 will end, and I have no idea how 9 will begin. And yet I've got to get through 12 or 14 chapters.
In closing, one common thread that's woven its way throughout the fabric of the entire series, no matter who we talk to, is the fact that you can start writing at any age, whether you're young, whether you're retired, or anywhere in between. What are your thoughts on that particularly important message?
I was 35, and we were talking about my agent Toby. His mother was Mary Wesley. She didn't write till she was 70, and then had a huge success. So yeah, I actually think you have to wait a bit. My own feeling is that if you're 21, 22, you probably don't know enough about life. But, there are people around who disprove that. I mean, people do think it's a daunting thing to write a book. And I suppose it is, but having done about 60 of them, it doesn't daunt quite as much as it used to.
Mr. Cornwell, it's been a singular pleasure having your legendary company on the show. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Okay, thanks a lot.